The first NFL game, October 3rd, 1920. The year was 1920. The Great War had ended barely 2 years earlier, and America was changing faster than anyone could keep track of. Cities buzzed with industry, radio stations were just finding their voice, and cars were beginning to outnumber horses. In that backdrop of renewal and invention, a group of men scattered across the Midwest believed they could transform an unruly pastime into a professional sport. Football had existed for decades, but it was fragmented. College football ruled the headlines. Professional play was an afterthought, a messy collection of local teams, sandlot heroes, and regional leagues that came and went each fall. Many teams had no permanent stadiums. Players were paid in cash, often handed out from the gate receipts after a game. Rules varied from one county to the next, yet something was stirring. In September 1920, representatives from several independent teams met in an automobile showroom in Canton, Ohio, the Hupmobile dealership owned by Ralph Hay. They created the American Professional Football Association, or APFA, a name that would be changed 2 years later to the National Football League. Among the new member clubs were the Dayton Triangles, Columbus Panhandles, Akron Pros, Canton Bulldogs, Rochester Jeffersons, and others scattered across Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana. And just a few weeks after that meeting, on a cool October afternoon, one of those teams would host what history now remembers as the first official NFL game. The stage, Triangle Park in Dayton, Ohio. The teams, Dayton Triangles versus the Columbus Panhandles. Triangle Park sat where the Great Miami and Stillwater Rivers met in northern Dayton. It wasn't a massive stadium, but it was well kept, built for the company team of the Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, known locally as Delco. That's where the team's name, the Triangles, came from. A triangle-shaped logo representing the three companies that merged to form Delco. The park could seat about 5,000 spectators, though on October 3rd, 1920, fewer than that turned out. Estimates vary between 800 and 1,200 people. Admission cost 50 cents, and children could get in for a dime. No one there knew they were witnessing the birth of a national institution. They simply came to watch tough men collide on a fall Sunday. The air that day was crisp, around 60 degrees. The grass was short and uneven. The end zones weren't painted, the yard lines were chalked by hand, and goalposts were still positioned on the goal line, not at the back of the end zone. Helmets were optional, thin strips of leather that offered little protection. Shoulder pads were felt-stuffed canvas. Players wrapped their forearms with cloth tape, hoping to soften the hits. Vendors sold cigars and peanuts from small stands. Spectators sat on wooden bleachers or stood along the rope lines. There was no scoreboard, no PA system, and certainly no replay. But there was excitement, a murmur that something new was beginning. The Dayton Triangles were a disciplined squad. They had been playing together since 1913, formed from employees of Delco and other local factories. They were known for teamwork and fundamentals, not flash. Their coach and quarterback, Nelson "Bud" Talbot, was a former Yale lineman, big, clever, and respected. Their starback, Lou Partlow, was known as the Human Bullet for his straight-ahead running style. The Columbus Panhandles, by contrast, were rugged railroad men, literally. Most of the team worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Nesser brothers, in particular, 6 towering siblings who became legends of early pro football. Led by Joe Carr, who also served as the team's manager and would later become president of the NFL, the Panhandles were famous for traveling cheaply. They received free rail passes to away games, a benefit of their employment, and rode the trains together to play weekend football. On this day, though, the edge belonged to Dayton. The Triangles had a stable lineup and home field familiarity. The Panhandles were tough, but often relied on brute force over coordination. The teams warmed up quietly. No marching bands, no pre-game ceremonies. Just the muted thump of leather balls being kicked, shouted signals, and the hum of a small crowd leaning forward for the opening kickoff. The whistle blew. The crowd fell into a hush. Then, a clean kick, spiraling into the bright autumn air. Football in 1920 was a different game. The forward pass was legal but rarely used, too risky with the shape of the ball, which was rounder and harder to grip. Most plays were plunges through the line or sweeps around the end. The first quarter was a battle of field position. Mud clung to shoes, tackles landed with thuds, and each team fought for every yard. The Triangles line, led by George Tank Lowe, held strong, pushing back the Panhandle's rushes. Lou Partlow soon made his mark. Taking a handoff, he charged through a gap opened by tackle George Hobby Kinderdine, another founding figure of the Triangles. Partlow broke through two tacklers and lunged across the goal line. It was the first touchdown in NFL history. The crowd cheered, a modest cheer by modern standards, but enthusiastic. There were no fireworks, no replay screens, just applause and a few shouts of "Good run" echoing off the river. The extra point attempt followed, and Dayton's George Kip Kinderdine converted the kick. Triangles 7, Panhandles 0. The second quarter settled into a grind. Columbus fought back behind the bruising runs of Ted Nesser and the determined leadership of Frank Nesser, their best all-around athlete. But the Triangles' defense was organized. Dayton's players were smaller on average, but they tackled low and swarmed fast. Coach Talbot kept calling smart, short gains, line plunges that ate up the clock and wore down the Panhandles. Spectators could hear the grunts and shouts from the field. There were no microphones, only the raw sound of men colliding. The referees wore white shirts and bow ties. The game ball was dark and slick with use. By halftime, the Triangles still led 7-0. Players trudged to the sideline benches, gasping for air, drinking from tin pails of water. No locker rooms, no halftime show. Just 10 minutes of rest before returning to the field. In the third quarter, Partlow again broke loose for a long gain, setting up another score. Dayton's Frank Bacon, a quick, elusive back, took a sweep around the left side and dove across the line for the second touchdown. Kinderdine's kick made it 14-0. To understand that afternoon is to understand early football itself. There were no substitutions unless a player was injured. Each man played both offense and defense, often for the entire game. Plays were called by shouted code words, simple numbers, and huddles were brief. Penalties were frequent: offside, roughness, piling on. Referees used small handkerchiefs instead of flags. The crowd followed with printed programs that listed the players' numbers, though uniforms were barely legible by mid-game, smeared with mud. There was honor in endurance. Players weren't celebrities, they were laborers. Many returned to factory jobs the next morning, but on that day they were pioneers, testing whether professional football could be legitimate entertainment, not just a sideline brawl. Dayton's discipline continued to show. Every snap looked measured, every punt was deliberate. The Panhandles grew frustrated, unable to break through the line. The game had rhythm, a slow, pounding rhythm that felt more like trench warfare than sport. As the sun lowered behind the trees near the river, the shadows stretched across Triangle Park. The crowd stamped its feet against the chill. In the fourth quarter, Columbus mounted one last push. Frank Nesser dropped back for a rare pass, a long arc downfield, but it fell incomplete. The old-style ball wobbled awkwardly through the air, landing harmlessly in the grass. Dayton regained possession and played conservatively. They ran the ball, kicked for field position, and chewed the remaining minutes. With no 2-minute warnings, no play clocks, and no media breaks, time simply moved with the rhythm of the field. When the final whistle sounded, the score remained: Dayton Triangles 14, Columbus Panhandles 0. The small crowd clapped politely. Players shook hands, mud-streaked, exhausted, and unaware they had just closed the first official chapter of the NFL's story. After the game, the local paper, the Dayton Daily News, printed a short summary on page 13. No headlines, no photos, just a few paragraphs noting that the Triangles had beaten the Panhandles in a clean, hard-fought match. No one yet called it the first NFL game. To the players, it was simply another Sunday contest, But for the APFA, it was proof of concept. Teams could organize, follow shared rules, and compete professionally. The rest of the 1920 season unfolded unevenly. Schedules weren't fixed, and standings were decided by vote. But the seed was planted. The Triangles finished with a respectable record. The Akron Pros were crowned champions. Dayton's field would host more games, but the Triangles would gradually fade, moving cities and eventually becoming part of the lineage of the Indianapolis Colts decades later. Still, Triangle Park remained a landmark, the cradle of professional football. From that simple beginning, the league expanded, adding teams from Green Bay, Chicago, New York, and beyond. Rules evolved, helmets became mandatory, and passing transformed the game. But every innovation traced back to that afternoon in Dayton. The men who played there didn't earn fame or fortune. Most worked regular jobs into old age, yet they built the foundation for what would become one of the most watched spectacles in American life. In later years, historians revisited the records. The NFL officially recognized October 3, 1920, as the first game in its history. The score 14-0 became part of sports lore, a quiet milestone marking where a new era began. Triangle Park eventually closed after a tragic accident decades later, but the memory endured. A plaque now stands on the site, commemorating the game. Visitors still walk the grass, imagining the faint echoes of cheers, the thud of leather, and the smell of autumn air. If you stood there today at the confluence of the rivers in Dayton, you might hear the same breeze that swept across the field in 1920. The place feels ordinary, yet it's sacred in its simplicity. The story of the first NFL game isn't about spectacle. It's about ambition. It's about working-class men proving that a rough, local pastime could grow into something enduring. They had no idea that their effort that Sunday would lead to roaring stadiums, television broadcasts, and billions of fans worldwide. They only knew that they loved the game, and that it deserved a chance to be played seriously. From that small crowd of hundreds grew an audience of millions. From that muddy field grew an empire of sport, culture, and tradition. And it all began with a whistle, a leather ball, and a touchdown run by Lou Partlow, the first in the history of the National Football League.